All right, so I got the block all cleaned up. I've got my cylinder number 1 piston back up at top dead center. That keyway is facing up, which means that the crankshaft is in the right spot, at least on this engine, for when I go to put my timing back together and get the timing chain back on. So I've got my cylinder head gasket on top of the block, and of course I've got my set of new cylinder head bolts. The reason why I replaced the cylinder head bolts is because a lot of these bolts nowadays are torque to yield, so they stretch as you torque them down. And if I reuse the old ones, I don't want them to break or have any issues going down the road. So it is recommended to replace those head bolts. So I'm gonna go ahead and replace those just to be safe. So the first step in all this is to apply some RTV silicone to the bottom edge of the head gasket right here and right here on both the top and the bottom to help seal the head gasket to the block and of course the cylinder head because that's where the front cover goes. So I've got this ultra black gasket maker. It is oil resistant, so I'm gonna go ahead and use that. It doesn't have to be a lot, just a little bit. I'm just gonna peel the gasket up and put a dabble of it on the edges here of the gasket. So now I'm gonna go ahead and grab my cylinder head, slap that on. Okay. Now it's in place. So I'm gonna go ahead and put my bolts in. So I'm gonna have to take those washers off and reuse just the washers. All right, so what I'm gonna do just to get these started is I'm gonna run them in with this, but I'm not gonna actually tighten them. To tighten these bolts in sequence, there's 3 steps to this. First is at 36 foot-pounds, so I'm gonna set my torque wrench to of course 36 foot-pounds. That's just to get them started. Now I've got them all tightened down to 36, so I'm going to go in sequence. The first step is 90 degrees. So you start at a certain angle and rotate it 90 degrees, and then it's 45 degrees for the second step. And then I'm going to go 90 degrees. So it's going to be from here to here. So there's 90 degrees. Number 10. So now the last step is to tighten the rest of the bolts in sequence, starting with 1 to 45 degrees. And this is something you can eyeball. You could technically use a torque angle gauge, but honestly with 90 and 45 degree angles, it's pretty easy to just watch the ratchet. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and get this oil pump chain off and replace that. I've got a Cloy's kit, which is a pretty good brand. It comes with everything you need. The guides, the sprockets, the chain, of course the guide for the oil pump chain. All right, so now that I got those in, I've got that dot lined up with that colored link. Same way with this one. Everything is in. I got to torque down that oil pump nut. All right, so what I'm going to do to torque down that nut for the oil pump sprocket is I'm going to temporarily tighten this bolt so I can hold the crankshaft in place. That nut should be torqued to 21 foot-pounds. That bolt for the guide should be torqued down to 7 foot-pounds, which is also equal to 84 inch-pounds. And there's 7 foot-pounds. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to get cylinder number 1 back at top dead center of compression because the engine did move a little bit. You want that keyway to be facing straight up, not up, level, but up towards the top of the engine. And of course you don't want to forget about these little caps. They go right on top of the valves. All right, so I've got the cam housing cleaned up, ready to go. The main thing is you just want to make sure it's of course clean, but also all those gasket surfaces needs to be nice and dry. So I'm gonna take my RTV gasket maker and apply it to the top of the cylinder head here. Get the camshafts in and get those rocker arms in. All these bearing surfaces you want to make sure are nice and clean. Make sure there's no debris in them. I like to just kind of wipe my finger across it just to make sure there's no gunk inside of there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a little bit of oil to those bearings. And when I go to torque down the rest of the bolts for the camshaft housing assembly, there's a sequence that you want to go in. So I'm gonna go ahead and install my rocker arms. Timing marks work is that one there should be up on top. Those should be off to the side. So I'm gonna place the camshaft in that location. All right, so what I'm gonna do next is I'm just gonna get these bolts started. I'm not gonna go heavy on the trigger. I just want to get them bottomed out to where I can start to torque them. So the torque spec for this first round is 12 foot-pounds. I'm going to do the same thing with the other bolts. All right, so now I'm gonna start tightening these in sequence to 20 foot-pounds. All right, so the next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go around and just double check all those bolts. All right, so now that all these are torqued down and sealed up, I'm gonna go ahead and start working on the tie. So that wrench will fit in between the camshaft like that, so you can turn the camshaft as needed to line up the timing marks for the timing chain. Should work for this one too. Yep, works good for that one. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna work on installing this new cam sprocket. The kit did come with it. You could technically buy this VVT actuator sprocket assembly, but the teeth on this one actually look in really good shape. The one on this one, they look a little worn down, so I'm gonna go ahead and replace that one because it came with the kit. So what you want to do is you want to hold this in place with the wrench to loosen up that bolt. There's a little bit of wear on that sprocket on the sides. I mean, this car's got 280,000 miles on it, so it doesn't surprise me. So you just want to make sure you line up that mark with the camshaft there. It looks like that sprocket really only goes on one way though. All right, so that bolt gets torqued to 40 foot-pounds. All right, so next step is to put the guide in. I'm gonna get the guide and chain situated and show you guys how to torque those. So those guide bolts there are tight. Those get torqued down to 15 foot-pounds. All right, so I got my timing chain in. I've got the marks lined up. You want that yellow mark on that dot on the crank pulley. You want the keyway to be facing up towards the top of the engine. You want that mark between those two orange links. You want no slack on the chain. And you want that mark lined up with your orange link right there. There's also another mark right there and right there that you want to be facing this way, so that way you know that you got that camshaft on the right mark. Before I put this all back together, I'm going to replace these O-rings. There's two there. Another one down there by that timing chain. And I'm going to have to apply RTV silicone to the block all the way around. And then it'll be time to put my front cover on. The guide for this side is held in by the timing cover. So it's a real pain in the butt because you have to hold the timing guide in place while you put the cover on the engine. So it's tricky, it's difficult, but it can be done with two hands. So I'm not going to really be able to film that part because I'm going to need both my hands. All right, before I put that front cover on, I do want to go ahead and install that little vibration damper. Those bolts get torqued down to 84 inch-pounds or 7 foot-pounds. I've got the chain ready to go. I've got everything installed for my front cover. That mark's lined up. That mark's lined up. That is in. My other guide is in. I am able to kind of rest it up against the side of the engine block so that it doesn't drop down. That guide is not bolted down. It's held in place by the front cover, and then eventually the tensioner will push on it to maintain tension on the chain. So you got to be careful not to touch it too much, otherwise it'll just fall back down, the chain will lose its slack, and it might throw it out of whack and get it out of time. I'm gonna put RTV along the block carefully so that I don't mess up my chains, and then I'm gonna install my front cover. Before I do install my front cover, I'm gonna get it cleaned up, clean off all the gasket surfaces, and I'll show you guys how to install the crankshaft seal. All right, so the next thing I'm gonna do is replace this crankshaft seal on the front cover. The seal puller is kind of nice because it grabs onto the seal and pulls it out of there. So there's my old seal. There's my new one. So that's how you want it to look when you're done. On these engines, these seals don't bottom out. They'll just pop right through. So the way I like to do it is with that little rubber mallet in my fingers and just tap it in all the way around till it's flush with the top of that surface there. And of course, I've got my gasket surfaces cleaned up. I'm gonna take my compressed air, blow all this off, get this cleaned up. One thing to take note of is these two holes are sealed by the O-rings. This hole is not. That hole needs silicone on it. That is a bolt hole. And there is also a seal for that bolt as well. All right, so now that I've got it started, I'm gonna go around and just snug up a few bolts. That way the cover is pushed up against the block so that that RTV starts to seal properly. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and torque all those bolts in sequence. So the next thing you want to do is you also want to just go around and make sure that the silicone pushed out around all the edges, because it is kind of tricky to get that cover on there without messing up the silicone. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and torque all these bolts in sequence. All right, so now that I've got all the bolts tightened up for the front cover, the engine mount, the water pump, and the oil filter housing way down in there, everything's torqued up, everything's ready to go. Now it's time to put in the tensioner. What I've noticed is these never come with gaskets, so you got to put silicone on them all the way around. And there is a certain way you have to install it. Otherwise, that will not make contact with the guide. And the way these work is as this is put under tension, that piece will actually fall down, and then you're good to go. It just rides around with that piece dangling on the bottom there. You can reset these if you need to, if it accidentally pops out of place. What you want to do is you want to put this in, tighten it up. There's two nuts that tighten it down, and then you crank the engine over by hand via the crankshaft, and it will automatically put tension on the chain. So you don't have to really worry about adjusting this at all. It's all automatic. And it goes in on the back side right there. All right, so now I've got that tensioner in place right there. My next project is I'm gonna start putting the exhaust manifold back in place. I do have a new gasket for that. And of course I'm gonna tighten up those nuts, snug those up. I cleaned both gasket surfaces So that way we know we get a good seal. And at this point, pretty much every bolt on this engine, I'm just going to snug up with a ratchet, get it nice and tight. Just, you know, tighten it up with my hands, with my ratchet. Because you don't really need to torque every single bolt on this engine. The ones that are most important are, of course, anything timing related, anything related to those camshafts, the cylinder head bolts, that front cover, because it's just such a wonky design with bolts everywhere and you don't want it to warp. So the next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and get my harmonic balancer installed. On other vehicles with this engine, of course it drives the belt. On this vehicle it does not, because it's a hybrid, but they still give us this harmonic balancer pulley anyways, because this engine is actually used in the Pontiac Vibes, Toyota Matrix. Sure, there's other engines or other vehicles it's used in. So I'm just gonna go ahead and line this up with the keyway. Kind of lock it on by hand, or at least try to. It's on. Next, I'll put the bolt in. So I'm gonna go ahead and use my impact gun to tighten up this crank pulley bolt here. You want to be careful not to overdo it though, because you don't want to break that off. That's good enough. Enough to where it won't come loose. Alright, so what I'm going to do next, I'm going to take my ratchet, I'm going to turn this engine over by hand to get that tensioner down in there to tension the chain. As you crank this over, that tensioner, like I said, will pop out and put tension on the chain. We want there to be tension before we actually start the engine. Just keep in mind that as you crank this over, you're probably never going to get those marks to line back up. So it's very important to make sure that they're lined up before you do this. Otherwise, good luck. Sometimes you get lucky and it comes around in just the right spot where they do line up, but it takes a long time to get those marks to line back up. So I know that everything's in time. I know my crank is in time with my cams. All my marks are lined up. So I'm just going to go ahead and crank this over by hand. So don't forget about those two bolts there for the exhaust bracket. I've got the nuts in place and snugged up for the exhaust manifold. Oh, look at those nice fancy new gaskets. They look good. The exhaust hangers go back in place. To put those back in, it can get a little tricky sometimes. All right, so I'm at the point where I'm ready to put my valve cover on. That chain has tension now. One thing to take note of as well is this gasket, whatever that is. It's like an O-ring as well. Anyways, that gasket is very hard to find. You can technically buy them online, but they don't come in the kits, and you can't buy them at the part stores. I've lost these before, and they're very hard to get a hold of. So yeah, they don't come in the head gasket kit. You can get them through Toyota, but they're not really pricey, but they're hard to get, and there's not a whole lot of them in stock. So try not to lose that. For whatever reason, they don't really sell it. I'm gonna go ahead and replace those seals for the spark plug tubes. When those go bad, you start to get some oil down inside the spark plug tubes, which you don't want that. You want to make sure they're orientated in the right direction. This end goes down as you're installing it, so that way it faces up when you put the valve cover in. And I like to just use a socket and a hammer to hit that in flush. Time to put the valve cover gasket in. So what you want to do is put a dabble of silicone right here and right here on those edges where the cylinder head meets the front cover. I do recommend replacing those fuel injector seals. If those go bad, you'll have a vacuum leak and possibly a check engine light, so the new kit comes with new ones. All right, now it's time for some spark plugs. I'm just going to snug those up with my ratchet. Might as well slap the coil packs back in. This goes back here on top of the manifold. And there's going to be a couple of bolts that hold it in place. One thing to take note of is this EGR tube right here. These are known to get gummed up with carbon. So you're going to want to take like a pick or a piece of wire or something and run it through there and clean out all that carbon buildup and get that out of there. If you clean this up, it might actually improve the fuel economy. So that whole piece right there goes down in the side over here. So I'm gonna work on putting that back on. Then I'm gonna work on putting my intake on, my intake manifold, my fuel injectors. Of course, my coolant hoses had to go on first, right? So I got my coolant hose there, another one right there. Once the intake manifold is on, I'm gonna start focusing on my wiring harness and getting all that back in place. And then for the engine mount that goes right in here, I'm just going to use my impact gun to tighten up those bolts, get that in place, and get that on. All right, so my advice here, guys, is get that fuel rail started before you put that EGR valve assembly in. If you put this in first, you're not going to be able to get that fuel line in place because it goes up and over that coolant hose. And then you have to bolt down that bracket right there to the cylinder head, and you won't be able to get to it or get it underneath of this piece if you bolt this up first. All right, I got the intake ready to go, got the new gasket on there. There's really nothing else to put in. All right, I got the hoses on, got the water pump hooked up, got that coolant tank bolted back up, got the engine mount in. All that's bolted up right there. Everything's bolted up over here. Got to put that hose in still. So another hose to go there, but the other, heater hoses are in. So yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and put the intake back on, and then once that's on, I can start plugging everything back in. All right, guys, so I got everything back together. I've got everything plugged in. Still have to put in the cowl for the wiper motor. But I'm at the point now where this engine will run. Of course, I'm gonna have to remember to top off the coolant. 50/50 water and antifreeze. I've got the universal, all makes, all models antifreeze that works good. This system is completely empty as far as the coolant goes, so I can for sure use that all makes, all models, and it won't cause any damage. Usually it mixes pretty well with other coolants anyways. But before I get too far, I want to explain what I'm doing next. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put automatic transmission fluid in where the oil goes. So the reason why I do that after a head gasket job is because if there's any cross-contamination, if the coolant wound up in the oil, or if there's just a bunch of debris from the job, you know, down in the oil or in the oil pan or any of those oil passages, the transmission fluid will, of course, lubricate all the moving parts, the bearings, the camshafts, the valves, that type of stuff. Just like oil would. Of course, you don't want to drive on it for 3,000 miles, but what it does is it has a detergent in it, and it helps clean out that engine. It helps clean out all those oil passages inside the engine. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put, like I said, that automatic transmission fluid in the engine where the oil goes. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna let that run for about 5, 10, maybe 15 minutes. And then I'm gonna change out that old filter and automatic trans fluid for a new filter, and of course the correct motor oil. And then this engine's good to go. All right, so now I've got the engine running. I'm gonna top off the antifreeze. I've got my little pedal depressor on there, and okay, it's not overheating, so there's no warning message for that. What I'm gonna do next is I'm gonna just let it run. I'm gonna top off the coolant as it's running to get the air bubbles out of the cooling system. There is gonna be a little bit of smoke back there from spilled coolant burning off the pipe. The reason why I'm topping off the coolant while the engine's running is because while it's running, that coolant's gonna be circulating through the engine, and by topping it off while the engine's running, it helps get those air bubbles out of the system. The other thing I like to do on pretty much any car is take it for a nice long test drive with the coolant topped off a little bit past full, and then when I come back I let it cool down and then top the coolant off after that, and it should be good to go. But this is another way to get the air out of the cooling system. You want to make sure that there's no air in that cooling system. And after the coolant is good to go, I'm going to have to, of course, put that cowl piece back in and the wiper motor, get all those bolts back in, and then this job is done. I did run into an issue with this one, and I have another video on the Prius death rattle. The engine's running great. I've got another video that you guys can check out on causes of the Prius death rattle. But on this head gasket job, to wrap it up and get that engine running good, all I had to do was re-gap the spark plugs. But yeah, I also checked compression on this engine. I've got a video on how to check compression on this. It's a separate video, just like a generic how-to video. But compression was good. It's running great. Topping off the coolant. And yeah, so that's how you do a head gasket on a Toyota Prius.